What happens when military doctrine dismisses individual innovation, only to be proven catastrophically wrong by a single impossible shot? Picture the Western Front in 1915, where trench warfare had ossified into brutal stalemate. British and German forces faced each other across no man's land, separated by barbed wire, machine gun nests, and the certainty that any soldier who showed himself above the parapet would die within seconds. Officers on both sides struggled with how to observe enemy positions without becoming targets themselves. Periscopes helped, but they provided limited fields of view. Direct observation was suicidal. Into this impossible situation stepped a young British soldier with an idea that his superiors dismissed as impractical, even foolish, using narrow gaps between support beams in trench construction to create concealed sniper positions that would allow shots at ranges traditional marksmanship considered impossible. His name has been lost to history, or perhaps was never recorded with the prominence it deserved. But his innovation, what came to be known informally as the beam gap sniper angle, represented a fundamental rethinking of how snipers could operate in trench warfare. Traditional sniping positions in trenches were obvious: loopholes cut into parapets, fortified positions that enemy observers quickly identified and targeted. This soldier proposed something different, identifying natural gaps in trench construction where support beams created narrow sight lines, positions so innocuous that enemy forces would never think to watch them, angles so oblique that they seemed useless for accurate shooting. His superiors looked at his proposal and saw impracticality. The angles were too narrow, the ranges too long. The whole concept violated established principles of marksmanship and fieldcraft. Then came the shot that changed everything. At approximately 480 yards, a distance that would challenge even modern rifles with telescopic sights, this unheralded marksman fired through one of his unconventional positions and killed a German officer who had been observing British lines through field glasses. The officer had been standing in what he thought was a safe position, protected by the geometry of trench construction from conventional sniper fire. He was wrong. The bullet struck him in the head, killing him instantly. German soldiers who witnessed the death were baffled. Where had the shot come from? They could see no obvious British sniper position, no loophole, no firing port, nothing that explained how a bullet could have reached their officer from that angle. British command, previously dismissive of the beam gap technique, suddenly became very interested in what their unconventional marksman had accomplished. This is the story of innovation born from necessity, of individual insight overcoming institutional resistance, and of how warfare's brutal demands sometimes validate ideas that seem absurd until they work. It is a story largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by more famous snipers and more dramatic battles, but it illustrates fundamental truths about military innovation, the relationship between individual soldiers and command structures, and the often random nature of how tactical breakthroughs occur in warfare. The significance of this innovation extends beyond its immediate tactical utility. It represents a case study in how warfare accelerates innovation through desperate necessity, how hierarchical military organizations struggle to incorporate ideas from unexpected sources, and how the difference between theoretical possibility and practical achievement often rests on individual skill and determination. The beam gap technique was not a weapon that changed the course of the war, but it was an idea that changed how British snipers thought about their craft and their environment, turning what others saw as structural necessities into tactical opportunities. The Western Front of World War I was unlike any battlefield that had preceded it. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, opposing armies dug into elaborate trench systems that would remain largely static for 4 years of horrific combat. These trenches were not simple ditches, but complex fortifications featuring multiple lines of defense, communication trenches, command bunkers, aid stations, ammunition stores, and living quarters for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The engineering required to construct and maintain these systems was extraordinary, but the basic principle was simple: dig below ground level to avoid the increasingly deadly firepower of modern weapons. Trench warfare emerged because defensive technologies, machine guns, barbed wire, artillery with indirect fire capability, had temporarily gained decisive advantage over offensive capabilities. Attacking infantry crossing no man's land faced withering fire from multiple directions with no cover. Casualties were catastrophic. The First Battle of the Ypres in 1914 The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in 1915 and countless smaller engagements demonstrated that frontal assaults against prepared defenses were suicidal without adequate preparation and overwhelming force. As a result, both sides dug in, creating the deadlock that would characterize the Western Front for most of the war. Within this static warfare environment, observation became critically important. Commanders needed to know what enemy forces were doing. Were they bringing up reserves for an attack, moving artillery, reinforcing weak points, or preparing to withdraw? Infantry needed to identify machine gun positions, sniper locations, and artillery observers. Artillery needed forward observers to adjust fire onto targets they could not see from their gun positions miles behind the lines. All of this required soldiers to observe enemy positions, but observation meant exposure, and exposure meant death. The problem of observation without exposure drove numerous innovations. Periscopes allowed soldiers to see over parapets without exposing their heads. Trench mirrors provided oblique viewing angles. Artillery observers climbed into trees or ruined buildings to gain elevation, though such positions attracted immediate enemy fire once discovered. Aerial reconnaissance provided strategic overview, but lacked tactical detail. The challenge remained. How could ground forces observe enemy positions in sufficient detail to support operations without losing observers to enemy fire? Snipers occupied a unique position in this observation problem. Unlike ordinary infantry, snipers were trained marksmen equipped with specialized rifles and, increasingly as the war progressed, telescopic sights. Their mission was twofold: eliminate high-value enemy targets such as officers, artillery observers, and enemy snipers, and provide detailed observation of enemy positions and activities. A skilled sniper could observe for hours, noting patterns of movement, identifying unit insignia, and reporting information that contributed to intelligence assessments. But snipers faced the same exposure problem as everyone else, compounded by the fact that enemy snipers were specifically hunting them. British Army sniping in the war's early years was relatively unsophisticated compared to what it would become. The Army entered the war with some appreciation for marksmanship. Shooting had long been emphasized in British infantry training, but without systematic sniper training or specialized equipment. German forces, by contrast, had developed more sophisticated sniping capabilities before the war, with hunting rifles equipped with telescopic sights and soldiers who understood fieldcraft from civilian hunting experience. In the war's early months, German snipers inflicted disproportionate casualties on British forces, picking off officers, NCOs, and anyone careless enough to expose themselves. The British response evolved gradually. Major Hesketh Pritchard, a big-game hunter and marksman, was instrumental in establishing systematic sniper training for British forces. Specialized sniper schools were created where soldiers learned marksmanship, fieldcraft, camouflage, observation techniques, and the psychology of the sniper's role. Equipment improved, with specialized rifles, telescopic sights, and camouflage materials becoming standard issue for qualified snipers. By 1915-1916, British sniping capabilities had improved dramatically, though they never entirely closed the gap with German proficiency. Sniper positions in trenches followed certain patterns dictated by tactical necessity and physical constraints. The most common position was a prepared loophole, a small opening cut through the parapet sandbags or wooden revetments, often reinforced with steel plates and designed to be as inconspicuous as possible. These loopholes allowed snipers to fire while remaining protected, but they had significant disadvantages. Once identified by enemy observers, loopholes attracted artillery fire and attention from enemy snipers. They were also limited in field of view and could not be easily repositioned once constructed. Finally, the same geometry that protected the sniper also constrained firing angles, limiting which targets could be engaged from any given loophole. The alternative to fixed loopholes was improvised positions, snipers finding or creating firing positions in rubble, damaged fortifications, shell craters, or natural features. These improvised positions offered flexibility and the element of surprise, but also increased risk. The sniper had to move to the position, occupy it long enough to observe and engage targets, and then withdraw without being detected or killed. This required exceptional fieldcraft, patience, and nerve. Many snipers died because they stayed in an improvised position too long or failed to recognize that they had been spotted before taking their shot. The concept of exploiting gaps in construction, what would come to be known as the beam gap sniper angle, represented a third approach that combined elements of both prepared positions and improvised fieldcraft. Trench construction used wooden beams, steel I-beams, corrugated metal sheets and sandbags to create structures that could support tons of earth and resist artillery impacts. These construction materials, particularly the support beams that held up overhead cover and revetments, created gaps and spaces that were structural necessities but not deliberately designed as firing ports. Most soldiers and officers looked at these gaps and saw structural elements. The innovative sniper whose story we are telling looked at them and saw opportunity. The geometry involved was complex. A gap between support beams might be only a few inches wide, but if it aligned properly with the trench's overall geometry, it could provide a sightline to enemy positions that were theoretically protected from conventional fire. The angle would be oblique, often extremely so, requiring the sniper to position himself awkwardly and compensate for parallax and other optical complications. The field of view would be severely restricted, making target acquisition difficult, but the position would be nearly invisible to enemy observation because it didn't look like a firing position. It was just a gap between beams, one of thousands in the trench system, indistinguishable from countless others that posed no threat. Exploiting such positions required specialized skills. The sniper needed to identify gaps that offered useful sightlines, a process that required careful reconnaissance and spatial reasoning. He needed to calculate firing angles that accounted for the oblique perspective and restricted field of view. He needed to position his rifle and body in awkward configurations that normal shooting stances didn't accommodate. Most challenging, he needed to make accurate shots at extended ranges through these restricted positions, compensating for all the factors that made precision shooting difficult, even under ideal conditions. This was the innovation that command initially dismissed. When the young soldier, whose name history has largely forgotten, proposed using beam gaps as sniper positions, his superiors likely objected on multiple grounds. First, the angles were wrong, too oblique for accurate shooting according to conventional marksmanship doctrine. Second, the positions offered no protection if discovered. Unlike reinforced loopholes, a beam gap provided no ballistic protection to the sniper. Third, the restricted fields of view made target acquisition nearly impossible. Fourth, the awkward shooting positions would fatigue the sniper and degrade accuracy. The objections were reasonable from the perspective of conventional thinking. They were also wrong. The transformation of trench warfare from mobile operations to static siege represented one of the war's most significant tactical evolutions. When armies first began digging trenches in fall 1914, most commanders viewed them as temporary expedients, positions to be held briefly before resuming maneuver warfare. As weeks became months and trenches deepened and expanded, military leaders gradually recognized that they faced a fundamentally new form of warfare requiring new tactics, new equipment, and new ways of thinking about combat operations. This recognition came slowly and unevenly, with different commanders and different national armies adapting at different rates. The British Army's adaptation to trench warfare involved learning from experience, adopting innovations from allies and enemies, and developing original solutions to unprecedented problems. Sniper warfare emerged as one critical adaptation. Early in the war, British forces suffered heavily from German snipers who had better training, better equipment, and better understanding of how to operate effectively in static warfare conditions. The British response, establishing sniper schools, improving equipment, developing doctrine, took time to implement and longer still to show results. By 1915, when our innovator was proposing his beam gap technique, British sniper capabilities had improved but remained inferior to German standards in many respects. The cultural context of the British Army in 1915 shaped how innovations were received and evaluated. Despite the war's unprecedented challenges, the Army retained much of its peacetime culture, including rigid hierarchy, deference to seniority, and suspicion of ideas originating from enlisted ranks. Junior officers and enlisted soldiers who proposed innovations faced institutional skepticism, regardless of their ideas' merit. This conservatism served some useful purposes. It prevented adoption of every harebrained scheme proposed by well-meaning but inexperienced soldiers, but it also created friction against necessary adaptation. Ideas that challenged established doctrine or came from unconventional sources faced particular resistance. The beam gap innovation emerged in this context, a military organization struggling to adapt to unprecedented warfare, a tactical problem, how to observe and engage enemy targets without exposure, that existing solutions addressed inadequately, and an individual soldier with spatial reasoning abilities and marksmanship skills that let him see opportunities others missed. The collision between individual innovation and institutional conservatism was perhaps inevitable, as was the eventual resolution through practical demonstration that the technique worked despite theoretical objections. The identity of the soldier who developed the beam gap technique remains frustratingly obscure. Unlike famous snipers whose names and records were preserved, Francis Pegamagabo, Billy Singh, Herbert McBride, this innovator apparently never received the recognition that would ensure his place in military history. We know he existed because the technique itself entered British sniper doctrine, because veterans' accounts mention it, and because German sources reference mysterious casualties from angles that shouldn't have permitted enemy fire. But whether his anonymity resulted from deliberate security concerns, bureaucratic oversight, or the simple fact that individual soldiers' innovations often went unrecorded, remains unclear. What we can infer from circumstantial evidence and veterans' accounts is a rough outline of his background and the circumstances that led to the innovation. He was likely an experienced marksman before the war, possibly a competitive shooter or hunter who understood rifles and ballistics intuitively. His grasp of geometry and angles suggests education beyond elementary level, perhaps a skilled tradesman, engineer, or surveyor in civilian life. These professions would have provided the spatial reasoning skills necessary to conceptualize how beam gaps could be exploited for sniping despite their unconventional geometry. He probably arrived on the Western Front sometime in 1914 or early 1915, during the period when trench warfare was solidifying, but British sniper doctrine remained undeveloped. The frustration of watching German snipers operate with impunity, combined with his own understanding of marksmanship, likely motivated him to think creatively about sniper positions. Most soldiers accepted the tactical situation as given. This is where we can shoot from. These are the targets we can engage. These are the limitations we must accept. Innovators question these assumptions, looking for opportunities where others see only constraints. The development of the beam gap technique probably involved considerable trial and error. The sniper would have needed to identify potential gaps, assess their sight lines, test firing positions, and refine his techniques through repeated attempts. This experimentation carried significant risk. Each time he occupied an unconventional position to test its viability, he risked exposure to enemy fire. If enemy observers detected unusual activity or noticed muzzle flash from an unexpected location, he could become a target before validating whether the position was tactically useful. The fact that he survived this experimentation phase suggests both skill and luck. His initial presentations of the technique to superiors likely met with skepticism bordering on dismissal. British Army culture in 1915 still reflected peacetime hierarchy and conventional thinking despite the war's challenges. Innovation from enlisted ranks was often viewed with suspicion, the attitude being that if a technique were viable, officers and experts would have already identified it. An enlisted soldier proposing an unconventional sniping method that contradicted established doctrine would have faced institutional resistance regardless of the idea's merit. His superiors probably listened politely, raised the objections mentioned earlier, and sent him back to his duties without seriously considering implementation. What changed the equation was practical demonstration. Whether through official channels or individual initiative, the sniper apparently began using beam gap positions during his regular duties. The technique's first successes probably involved relatively unimportant targets, enemy soldiers who exposed themselves in positions they thought were safe from British fire. These early kills likely went unreported or were attributed to conventional sniping without recognition that unusual techniques had been employed. But as the sniper accumulated successes and began engaging targets at greater ranges through increasingly oblique angles, people noticed. The German officer killed at 480 yards represented the technique's definitive validation. The circumstances of this shot deserve examination, even though details remain fragmentary. The range, 480 yards, was extraordinary for the conditions. Modern riflemen with accurized rifles, high-quality ammunition, and telescopic sights capable of precise range compensation can make such shots with reasonable probability of success. A World War I sniper, using a service rifle with rudimentary telescopic sight and ammunition that varied significantly in quality and consistency, attempting such a shot through a narrow gap at an oblique angle was attempting something that ballistics experts of the era would have considered nearly impossible. The target's behavior contributed to both his vulnerability and the shot's impact. As an officer, likely a captain or major based on German staff organization, he was engaged in the essential but dangerous work of observing enemy positions. His position had been chosen carefully, far enough back from the front line to avoid random fire, situated where the trench geometry provided protection from known British sniper positions. He felt secure enough to use field glasses, which required him to remain relatively stationary for extended periods. He was wrong about his security, but his error was understandable given conventional assessment of British firing positions. The preparation for this shot would have been meticulous. The sniper had identified this particular beam gap position during his reconnaissance, noted that it provided a sightline into a section of German trench where officers occasionally appeared, and had probably observed the position multiple times to understand patterns of enemy activity. When the German officer appeared in his field of view, the sniper would have needed to make rapid calculations about whether conditions were favorable for an attempt, wind speed and direction, his own physical state, the amount of time the target might remain stationary. All these factors influenced whether to take the shot. The sniper who took this shot had to perform multiple complex calculations and physical actions nearly perfectly. First, he needed to identify the German officer as a valuable target, worth the risk of a difficult shot. Second, he needed to calculate range accurately enough to compensate for bullet drop over 480 yards, a non-trivial task with period equipment and the restricted view through a beam gap. Third, he needed to position himself in the awkward stance required by the beam gap geometry while maintaining enough stability for accurate shooting. Fourth, he needed to account for wind, which at that range could deflect a bullet by feet. Fifth, he needed to compensate for the oblique angle, which affected both trajectory and the precise point of aim. Finally, he needed to execute all of this while managing his own breathing, heart rate, and the mental pressure of attempting an extraordinarily difficult shot. The moment of firing must have been extraordinary. The rifle's report echoed through the trenches, immediately alerting everyone to the shot. The bullet traversed the 480 yards in approximately 1 second, traveling at roughly 2,000 feet per second for a standard British .303 round. In that second, nothing could change the outcome. The trajectory was fixed by physics. Either the calculations were correct and the execution sufficient, or they were not. The bullet struck the German officer in the head, killing him instantly. German soldiers nearby immediately dove for cover, unsure where the shot had come from. British soldiers in the surrounding trenches looked toward the sound of the shot, confused about why someone was firing when no attack was underway. The immediate aftermath involved confusion on both sides. German forces attempted to locate the British sniper position that had taken the shot. Their observers examined known British sniper locations, looking for muzzle flash signatures or movement that would identify the shooter. They found nothing obvious. The beam gap position was so unconventional, so unlikely, that it didn't register as a probable sniper location, even when German observers looked directly at the relevant section of British trench. This confusion was itself tactically valuable. An enemy who cannot identify where fire is coming from cannot effectively suppress it. British reaction was initially skeptical. When reports reached command that an enemy officer had been killed at approximately 480 yards through an unconventional position, some officers assumed the report was exaggerated or the result of a lucky shot rather than a replicable technique. But as evidence accumulated, witness statements from soldiers who had observed the shot, the clear death of the German officer confirmed by subsequent observation, and the sniper's own detailed explanation of his technique and position, skepticism gave way to interest. Someone at command level recognized that this might represent a genuine tactical innovation worth systematic exploitation. What followed was probably a formal demonstration for officers and sniper instructors. The innovative sniper would have been asked to identify beam gap positions, explain the geometry and ballistics involved, and demonstrate his technique under controlled conditions. This demonstration likely convinced observers that the technique was legitimate and replicable, not just a matter of extraordinary luck. The angles worked. The positions were viable. Skilled snipers could learn to exploit these unconventional firing points. The beam gap sniper angle transitioned from individual innovation to doctrinal technique. Implementation across the British sniper community required training and systematic identification of suitable positions. Not every gap between beams offered a useful sight line. Snipers needed to learn how to assess trench geometry, identify gaps that aligned with valuable observation areas in enemy trenches, and calculate the complex shooting solutions these positions required. This represented a significant training challenge, particularly for snipers who had learned conventional techniques and now needed to unlearn assumptions about proper shooting positions and angles. The techniques spread through British forces probably occurred gradually and unevenly. Elite sniper units with access to the best training and equipment adopted it quickly. Regular infantry units with limited sniper resources probably learned of it slowly, if at all. German forces eventually recognized that British snipers were achieving hits from unexpected angles and adjusted their own security practices accordingly, though the specific mechanism of beam gap exploitation apparently remained partially mysterious to them throughout the war. This combination of tactical surprise and technical complexity gave British snipers a temporary advantage that could be exploited until enemies adapted. The personal cost of developing this innovation deserves recognition. The sniper who pioneered the beam gap technique risked his life repeatedly during the experimentation phase, occupied dangerous positions during operational use, and faced potential censure from superiors who might have viewed his activities as reckless or insubordinate. He developed the technique not for glory or recognition, which he never received, but from professional dedication to his craft and determination to contribute more effectively to his unit's mission. This kind of quiet professionalism, unheralded and unrewarded, characterized many of the soldiers who served in the trenches and developed the small tactical innovations that collectively improved their survival and effectiveness. The question of whether our anonymous sniper survived the war remains unanswered. Sniper mortality rates were high, particularly among those who took the greatest risks and occupied the most dangerous positions. The same qualities that made him an effective innovator, willingness to experiment, aggression in seeking targets, patience in occupying exposed positions, also increased his vulnerability to enemy fire. He may have been killed in action, died of disease in the trenches, been wounded and evacuated, or survived to return home after the armistice. Without knowing his identity, we cannot trace his fate. He remains a ghost in the historical record, present only through the technique he developed and the single shot that validated it. The beam gap sniper technique illustrates several fundamental themes about military innovation: the relationship between individual initiative and institutional structures, and the nature of tactical evolution in warfare. Understanding these themes provides insight not just into this specific innovation, but into how militaries adapt to new challenges and how individuals can influence organizational change, even within rigid hierarchical structures. The first theme concerns the nature of tactical innovation itself. Military organizations are inherently conservative institutions, particularly regarding tactics and doctrine. This conservatism serves important purposes. Standardization allows for coordinated operations, established procedures reduce confusion under stress, and proven methods have demonstrated effectiveness. But conservatism also creates resistance to innovation, even when circumstances demand new approaches. The tension between institutional conservatism and the need for tactical adaptation characterizes all military organizations in all eras. The beam gap technique challenged multiple assumptions embedded in British sniper doctrine. First, it violated conventional wisdom about shooting positions, which emphasized stable ergonomic stances that maximized accuracy. Second, it ignored established principles about fields of view and observation, accepting severe restrictions that traditional doctrine considered disqualifying. Third, it embraced geometries that seemed to make precise shooting impossible according to standard ballistic calculations. Each of these violations was defensible from a conventional perspective, yet all proved irrelevant when confronted with practical success. This pattern, practical success overriding theoretical objections, appears repeatedly in military innovation. Weapons and tactics that theorists dismiss as impractical sometimes prove devastating in actual combat. The machine gun was initially dismissed by many military thinkers as a weapon of limited utility. suitable mainly for colonial policing rather than European warfare. The tank was ridiculed by cavalry officers as slow and unreliable. Airplanes were seen as reconnaissance curiosities rather than weapons platforms. In each case, practical demonstration in combat forced recognition that theoretical objections had been wrong or irrelevant. The second theme involves the relationship between individual soldiers and command structures. Military hierarchy exists to ensure coherent command and control, to prevent chaos through clear chains of authority and responsibility. But hierarchy also creates distance between those making decisions and those implementing them. Frontline soldiers observe tactical realities that staff officers miles behind the lines cannot perceive. Innovative individuals develop insights that conventional analysis misses. How military organizations capture and utilize this distributed intelligence determines how effectively they adapt to changing circumstances. The beam gap sniper's experience exemplifies the challenges individuals face when proposing innovations. His initial suggestions were dismissed not because officers were stupid or malicious, but because the proposals contradicted established doctrine and came from someone without formal authority to challenge that doctrine. The institutional default was to defer to established practices rather than experiment with unproven techniques suggested by an enlisted soldier. Only demonstrable success, the German officer killed at 480 yards, forced reconsideration. This suggests that military innovation often requires not just good ideas, but also practical validation that overcomes institutional resistance. The validation moment itself is worth examining more closely. The shot that killed the German officer succeeded, but it might easily have failed. If the bullet had missed by inches, entirely plausible given the shot's difficulty, the technique might have been dismissed as impractical despite its theoretical soundness. The innovator's credibility might have been damaged, making future proposals less likely to receive serious consideration. The role of luck in determining which innovations receive adoption and which are forgotten is often underappreciated in military history. We remember the successes and assume they succeeded because they were sound, when often success involves significant elements of chance. The third theme concerns the geometry of warfare and how physical constraints shape tactics. Trench warfare created unique spatial problems. Opposing forces were in constant proximity, separated by distances measured in yards rather than miles. Every position could potentially observe or be observed by enemy forces. Survival required exploiting any cover, any concealment, any geometric advantage that reduced exposure. This three-dimensional chess game, played with human lives as stakes, rewarded soldiers who could visualize spatial relationships and identify opportunities that others missed. The beam gap technique represented sophisticated geometric thinking applied to a tactical problem. The sniper had to visualize three-dimensional sightlines through narrow gaps, calculate how bullet trajectories would intersect with those sightlines, and identify target areas in enemy trenches that these unusual angles could reach. This required mental rotation of complex three-dimensional spaces, essentially solving engineering problems in his head while under combat stress. Modern military training increasingly emphasizes this kind of spatial reasoning, but in 1915, it was largely an innate skill rather than a trained competency. The mathematics of the oblique angle shooting involved several complicating factors that conventional marksmanship training did not address. When shooting through a narrow gap at an oblique angle, the apparent distance to the target differs from the actual ballistic distance the bullet travels. The sniper had to calculate the true range based on geometry, not just visual estimation. Additionally, the restricted aperture created parallax effects. The relationship between where the scope's reticle appeared to be pointing and where the barrel was actually aimed was not straightforward. Wind effects at oblique angles don't correspond simply to standard ballistic tables, requiring the sniper to develop intuitive understanding through experience rather than relying on formulaic calculations. The fourth theme involves the ballistics and marksmanship challenges that made the 480-yard shot so remarkable. Modern shooters, accustomed to sophisticated rifles, quality ammunition, and advanced optics, may underestimate how difficult precision shooting was with World War I equipment. British service rifles were accurate weapons by the standards of their era, but they lacked the consistency and precision of modern target rifles. Ammunition quality varied significantly from lot to lot, affecting velocity and therefore trajectory. Telescopic sights were primitive by current standards, with limited magnification and adjustment ranges. Wind estimation relied on observation and intuition rather than modern rangefinders and ballistic computers. At 480 yards with period equipment, a bullet would drop approximately 6 feet from the line of sight, assuming standard British .303 ammunition and typical muzzle velocity. Wind could deflect the bullet several feet horizontally. Small errors in range estimation or wind calculation would cause complete misses. The narrow gap through which the shot was taken added parallax issues and restricted the sniper's ability to observe bullet impact for follow-up shots. Success required near-perfect execution of every element: range estimation, wind reading, ballistic compensation, trigger control, and timing. The probability of hitting a human-sized target under these conditions would have been estimated at well under 10% by period marksmanship experts. That the shot succeeded reflects either exceptional skill, considerable luck, or most likely some combination of both. The rifle the sniper used was almost certainly a Lee Enfield No. 1 Mk3, the standard British service rifle, possibly selected for particularly good accuracy and equipped with a Patton 1914 or similar telescopic sight. The .303 British cartridge it fired had been in service since 1889 and was a proven, reliable round, though individual cartridges could vary significantly in performance. The bullet weighed approximately 174 grains and left the muzzle at around 2,440 feet per second. After traveling 480 yards, it would have slowed considerably due to air resistance, arriving at roughly 1,600 feet per second, still more than sufficient to kill on impact, but with a trajectory that had curved substantially from the initial line of bore. The fifth theme concerns the psychological dimensions of sniping and how they related to this particular innovation. Sniping is psychologically demanding in ways that conventional infantry combat is not. Infantry soldiers in assault operations act as part of groups with leadership, camaraderie, and forward momentum, carrying them through moments of maximum danger. Snipers operate individually or in two-person teams, making calculated decisions to kill specific human beings from positions of concealment. The sniper observes his target as an individual, noting his rank, his behavior, his humanity, before deliberately taking his life. This requires psychological compartmentalization that not all soldiers possess. The beam gap technique added psychological complexity. The sniper occupying such positions knew that if discovered, he would be targeted immediately with no protection except the speed with which he could withdraw. The awkward positions required for beam gap shooting created physical stress that compounded mental pressure. The difficulty of the shots meant a high probability of missing, which could alert enemies to his presence without neutralizing targets. Yet the sniper had to remain calm enough to execute precise shooting under all these pressures. This combination of mental, physical, and emotional demands made beam gap sniping accessible only to the most skilled and psychologically robust practitioners. The act of killing at distance through a telescopic sight creates unique psychological pressures. The sniper sees his target in magnified detail, observes him as a fellow human being going about his duties, and then makes a conscious decision to end that life. This is different from the relatively impersonal killing that occurs in artillery barrages or infantry assaults, where targets are distant, numerous, and not observed as individuals. Some snipers developed psychological mechanisms for managing this burden, viewing targets as enemy combatants rather than people, focusing on the tactical mission rather than the human cost, or compartmentalizing their emotions to avoid confronting the moral weight of their actions. Others were haunted by their kills, carrying psychological scars that persisted long after the war ended. The sixth theme involves the counter-sniper problem and the escalating tactical competition between opposing snipers. Each tactical innovation prompted counter-innovations. When British snipers began exploiting beam gaps, German forces eventually recognized that fire was coming from unexpected angles and began watching for telltale signs. Movement in areas previously considered non-threatening, debris patterns that might indicate concealed positions, or coordinated reconnaissance to map all possible firing positions regardless of how unlikely they seemed. This prompted British adaptations, using positions only once or twice before abandoning them, creating false beam gaps to waste enemy attention, and coordinating beam gap sniping with conventional sniping to confuse enemy analysis. This tactical evolution resembles evolutionary arms races in biology, where adaptations by one species prompt counter-adaptations by another in ongoing cycles of innovation. Military tactics evolve similarly, with innovations creating temporary advantages that enemies study and overcome, prompting further innovations in an endless cycle. The beam gap technique represented one iteration in this cycle, a temporary advantage that eventually became less effective as enemies adapted, but which had contributed meanwhile to the broader evolution of sniper tactics. The counter-sniper warfare that developed on the Western Front was sophisticated and deadly. Both sides employed specialized sniper hunters, whose mission was specifically to locate and eliminate enemy snipers. These hunters used various techniques: careful observation to detect muzzle flashes or scope glints, analysis of bullet trajectories to backtrack to firing positions, use of dummy targets to provoke enemy snipers into revealing themselves, and patient stalking operations that could last hours or days. The beam gap technique's value lay partly in how it complicated this counter-sniper warfare by presenting firing positions that didn't conform to expected patterns. The practical implementation of the beam gap technique required systematic solutions to multiple technical and tactical challenges. Understanding how these challenges were addressed provides insight into how military innovations transition from individual insights to doctrinal practices, and how soldiers adapt to unusual tactical situations. The first challenge involved identifying suitable positions. Not all beam gaps offered useful sightlines, and even experienced snipers initially struggled to distinguish productive positions from useless ones. The solution required developing a systematic survey methodology. Snipers would carefully reconnoiter their sections of trench, noting locations of support beams, overhead cover, and revetments. They would use surveying techniques, compass bearings, angle measurements, rough range finding, to determine which gaps aligned with specific areas of enemy trenches. This process was tedious and time-consuming, but essential for building a catalog of viable positions. Documentation became important as the technique spread. Early users probably kept informal notes about positions they had identified and tested. As the technique gained official recognition, these informal notes evolved into more formal records. Units began maintaining diagrams showing beam gap positions, their fields of fire, optimal ranges, and notes about which types of targets could be effectively engaged from each position. This documentation allowed knowledge to persist across unit rotations and casualties, ensuring that hard-won tactical insights weren't lost when individuals were killed or transferred. The creation of these position catalogs represented a form of institutional learning that military organizations excel at when they recognize an innovation's value. The same hierarchical structure and systematic approach that initially resisted the beam gap technique, once convinced of its validity, became mechanisms for preserving and disseminating knowledge about it. Officers who had dismissed the original proposal now supervised the creation of detailed records, ensuring that future snipers could benefit from the pioneering work of the technique's developer. The second challenge concerned the physical mechanics of shooting from beam gap positions. Conventional shooting positions emphasized stable, repeatable stances that minimized movement and maximized consistency. Beam gap positions often required awkward, uncomfortable postures that seemed to violate every principle of good marksmanship. Snipers had to contort themselves to achieve sightlines through narrow gaps, maintain these uncomfortable positions while aiming and firing, and do so while managing recoil that could knock them out of position. The solution involved developing specialized shooting techniques adapted to beam gap geometry. Rather than the conventional standing, kneeling, or prone positions taught in basic marksmanship, beam gap shooters often used hybrid positions, incorporating elements of multiple stances. They learned to use trench features, sandbags, wooden supports, equipment, as improvised rests that provided stability despite awkward angles. They practiced transitioning between reconnaissance posture, where they observed through the gap, and firing posture, where they positioned the rifle and themselves for the shot. This transition had to be smooth and quick to minimize exposure time. Breathing and trigger control techniques also required adaptation. Conventional shooting emphasized the respiratory pause, the natural cessation of breathing between exhale and inhale, as the optimal moment for trigger press. But beam gap positions sometimes required such physical effort to maintain that normal breathing patterns were disrupted. Snipers had to learn to shoot during compressed breathing cycles or to time their shots for moments when, despite awkward positioning, they could achieve momentary stability. This required extensive practice and a different understanding of the relationship between physiological state and shooting accuracy. The physical conditioning required for beam gap sniping was considerable. Maintaining awkward positions for extended periods demanded muscular endurance and flexibility that not all soldiers possessed. Snipers who used beam gap positions regularly developed specific muscle groups and postural adaptations that allowed them to sustain the uncomfortable shooting stances longer. This physical specialization was yet another way in which beam gap sniping represented a distinct subset of the sniper's craft, requiring not just marksmanship skills, but also physical capabilities developed through practice. The third challenge involved ballistic calculations for shooting at oblique angles through restricted apertures. Traditional marksmanship assumed relatively direct lines of sight and unrestricted fields of view. Beam gap shooting violated both assumptions. The restricted aperture created parallax issues. The scope's reticle and the target were not aligned in a straightforward way, requiring the sniper to compensate mentally for the offset. The oblique angles meant that apparent distances differed from true ballistic ranges, requiring adjustment in elevation settings. Wind estimation became more complex because wind effects at oblique angles don't correspond simply to standard ballistic tables. The solution required developing simplified rules of thumb that snipers could apply in the field. Precise ballistic calculations were impossible under combat conditions, but experienced snipers could estimate adjustments based on angle, range, and observable conditions. These rules of thumb were crude approximations rather than precise science, but they provided starting points that could be refined through observed results. A sniper who fired from a particular beam gap position might observe where his bullet impacted, perhaps hitting low and left of his aim point, and adjust subsequent shots accordingly. This trial and error process was wasteful of ammunition and time, but it was the only practical way to develop effective techniques for unconventional shooting positions. Some particularly mathematically inclined snipers attempted to develop more systematic calculation methods for beam gap shooting. They created reference tables showing correction factors for various angles and ranges, attempting to codify the ballistic principles involved in a form that could be applied quickly under field conditions. These efforts had limited success because the variables involved were too numerous and the conditions too variable for simple tables to provide reliable guidance. The most effective approach remained experiential learning, firing from specific positions repeatedly until intuitive understanding of the required corrections developed. The fourth challenge concerned target identification and observation through restricted fields of view. Conventional sniper positions offered reasonable visibility of enemy trench sections, allowing snipers to observe movement patterns, identify targets of opportunity, and wait for optimal shooting conditions. Beam gap positions often provided only narrow slices of visibility, seeing perhaps a few yards of enemy trench while remaining blind to adjacent areas. This made it difficult to identify high-value targets and to understand the tactical context of what they were observing. The solution involved coordinated observation networks. Beam gap snipers often worked with other observers, either conventional snipers in traditional positions or infantry sentries, who could provide broader situational awareness. Communication between observers allowed the beam gap sniper to understand when valuable targets might enter his restricted field of view. For example, a conventional observer might report seeing a group of German officers moving along a communication trench toward a sector that a beam gap position could cover. The beam gap sniper would then prepare, knowing that targets would likely enter his sightline within minutes. This coordination multiplied the effectiveness of the limited observation capability that any single beam gap position offered. Radio communication was not available at the individual sniper level in 1915, so coordination relied on runners, telephone lines to command posts, or pre-arranged signals. Snipers working in proximity might use simple hand signals or coded messages passed along the trench to coordinate their activities. This communication infrastructure, while primitive by modern standards, was sufficient to enable the kind of information sharing that made beam gap sniping more effective than it would have been with isolated snipers working independently. The fifth challenge involved managing the security of beam gap positions. Once enemy forces recognized that British snipers were using unconventional positions, they began searching for them systematically. A beam gap that provided an excellent sightline one day might be under enemy observation the next, turning from opportunity into death trap. Snipers needed ways to determine whether their positions were compromised without exposing themselves to verify. Several solutions emerged. First, beam gap positions were treated as temporary and disposable. After taking a shot, particularly one that killed an officer or other high-value target, the sniper would abandon that position and not return to it for days or weeks. This prevented enemies from identifying the position and preparing counter-sniper measures. Second, snipers developed techniques for approaching positions cautiously, using mirrors and periscopes to check whether the position was under observation before occupying it. Third, dummy positions were sometimes created to draw enemy attention, gaps made to look like active sniper positions through careful arrangement of sandbags or camouflage, causing enemies to waste observation resources on empty positions while real snipers operated elsewhere. The creation of dummy positions represented another evolution of the beam gap technique. Once British command recognized the value of beam gap sniping, they also recognized the value of deception. Engineers and snipers collaborated to create convincing false positions that would attract enemy attention and resources. These dummies might include carefully positioned equipment that suggested sniper activity, camouflage that appeared hastily arranged as if concealing a sniper, or even mechanical devices that created movement at irregular intervals to simulate human presence. The goal was to force German snipers and observers to watch numerous positions, diluting their attention and making it harder for them to identify which positions were genuinely dangerous. The sixth challenge concerned weapon and equipment optimization for beam gap shooting. Standard sniper rifles were designed for conventional employment, and some of their features were poorly suited to beam gap work. The most significant issue concerned rifle length. British service rifles like the Lee Enfield were relatively long, making them awkward to maneuver in the confined spaces and odd angles that beam gap positions required. Shorter rifles would have been easier to use, but were not generally available and would have sacrificed some ballistic performance. Adaptations included modified stocks that better accommodated awkward shooting positions, and in some cases, slightly shortened barrels that sacrificed minimal velocity for improved handling. Telescopic sight mounting systems were sometimes modified to allow the scope to be positioned further forward or rearward than standard, accommodating the unusual eye positions required by beam gap geometry. These modifications were often ad hoc, performed by unit armorers or talented soldiers, rather than through official channels, but they represented practical recognition that equipment designed for conventional use needed adaptation for unconventional applications. Some snipers experimented with alternative weapons for beam gap work, captured German hunting rifles, which were often shorter and lighter than military rifles, sometimes proved easier to maneuver in beam gap positions. However, ammunition supply for non-standard weapons was problematic, and the British .303 cartridge could not be used in rifles chambered for German calibers. These experiments generally proved impractical, and most beam gap snipers continued using standard Lee Enfield rifles despite their limitations, adapting their techniques to the weapon rather than the weapon to their techniques. The seventh challenge involved training additional snipers in beam gap techniques. The original innovator had developed his skills through personal experimentation and natural aptitude, but systematic training required breaking down his intuitive understanding into teachable components. This proved difficult because much of what made beam gap shooting effective involved spatial reasoning and physical adaptations that were hard to articulate explicitly. One cannot easily teach someone how to visualize three-dimensional sightlines through complex structures, or how to maintain stability in awkward shooting positions. These are skills that must be developed through practice and feedback. Training programs address this by combining classroom instruction with extensive practical work. Instructors use diagrams and physical models to explain geometric principles of beam gap sightlines. They demonstrated shooting positions and had students practice them repeatedly until awkward became familiar. Most importantly, they provided extensive live fire practice from actual or simulated beam gap positions, allowing students to develop their own understanding through experience. This training was time-intensive and couldn't produce qualified beam gap snipers as quickly as conventional sniper training produced traditional snipers, but it successfully transmitted the technique beyond the original innovator. The training process revealed something important about military learning. Some skills can be taught through instruction, while others must be learned through experience. Beam gap sniping fell into the latter category. Instructors could explain principles and demonstrate techniques, but actual proficiency came only through repeated practice under realistic conditions. Students had to develop their own intuitive understanding of how to compensate for oblique angles, how to maintain awkward positions, how to judge when conditions were favorable for a shot. This experiential learning took time and could not be rushed, which limited how quickly beam gap techniques could be disseminated through the sniper community. The beam gap sniper technique, while tactically innovative and occasionally effective, deserves critical examination regarding its limitations, costs, and place within the broader context of trench warfare. Uncritical celebration of any tactical innovation risks missing important lessons about what worked, what didn't, and why. The first limitation concerns effectiveness. While the 480-yard shot that validated the technique was dramatic, such successes were likely rare rather than routine. The technique's inherent difficulties, awkward shooting positions, restricted fields of view, complex ballistic calculations, meant that even skilled snipers achieved only occasional hits from beam gap positions. The hit rate was probably far lower than from conventional sniper positions, meaning that for every dramatic success, there were many failures that went unrecorded. This raises questions about whether the technique represented optimal use of limited sniper resources. Cost-benefit analysis in warfare is ethically fraught but tactically necessary. Deploying snipers to beam gap positions consumed time and ammunition that could have been used in conventional positions with higher probability of success. If a sniper spent 4 hours in a beam gap position and took 3 shots, all of which missed, was that a better use of his time than 4 hours in a conventional position where he might have achieved 2 kills? The answer depends on what targets were available in each position and what alternatives existed. But the question itself is important for understanding the technique's actual tactical value versus its dramatic appeal. The second limitation concerns vulnerability. Beam gap positions offered no protection if discovered. The sniper occupying such a position was fully exposed to return fire, and the unusual angles that made the positions valuable also made retreat difficult. A sniper in a conventional loophole could drop back quickly if enemy fire became too intense. A sniper contorted into a beam gap position might not be able to disengage quickly enough to avoid being hit. This vulnerability meant that beam gap shooting carried higher risks than conventional sniping, risks that only the most skilled practitioners could mitigate. The psychological toll of this vulnerability deserves recognition. Snipers are human beings, not machines, and they experience fear like anyone else. Occupying positions that offered no protection required exceptional courage or perhaps a degree of recklessness that not all soldiers possessed. Some snipers undoubtedly found the technique too stressful to employ effectively regardless of their marksmanship skills. Others may have developed a fatalistic acceptance of the risks, which is its own kind of psychological damage. The mental health costs of innovative tactics are rarely recorded, but were nonetheless real. The third limitation concerns scalability. Individual innovations developed by exceptional soldiers often prove difficult to replicate across broader forces. The beam gap technique required spatial reasoning, ballistic knowledge, and marksmanship skills that were uncommon even among trained snipers. It was never going to be a technique that every sniper could employ effectively, which limited its strategic impact. Military tactics that can be executed only by elite specialists have their place, but they cannot substitute for approaches that work across average units with typical soldiers. This limitation reflects a broader tension in military affairs between excellence and adequacy. Elite units performing specialized tasks often receive disproportionate attention and resources because their achievements are dramatic, but wars are won by adequate performance across entire armies, not by exceptional performance from small minorities. The beam gap technique was tactically interesting and occasionally valuable, but it was never going to be a war-winning innovation precisely because it was too difficult for widespread adoption. More important innovations, like systematic sniper training for ordinary infantry, improved camouflage techniques, and better coordination between artillery observers and gun batteries, were less dramatic but more impactful because they could be implemented broadly. The fourth critique concerns the technique's relationship to broader tactical problems. Trench warfare's fundamental challenge was not precision elimination of individual targets, but rather breaking through enemy defenses to restore maneuver warfare. Snipers contributed to attrition and suppression, but they could not win battles by themselves. The beam gap technique, for all its ingenuity, addressed a peripheral problem rather than a central one. It made incremental improvements to sniper effectiveness, but had no impact on the strategic deadlock that characterized the Western Front. This observation is not meant to dismiss the technique's value, but to contextualize it properly. Tactical innovations exist within strategic contexts, and their significance derives partly from how much they contribute to strategic objectives. The beam gap technique contributed marginally to attrition, killing some German officers and soldiers who might otherwise have survived, but it did not alter the fundamental equation that made trench warfare so bloody and static. More significant innovations, tanks, infiltration tactics, improved artillery techniques, coordinated combined arms operations, addressed the core problem of how to break through defenses. The beam gap technique addressed the ancillary problem of how to improve individual sniper effectiveness. The fifth critique concerns survivorship bias in how we remember the technique. We know about the successful 480-yard shot because it worked spectacularly. We do not know how many times snipers attempted similar shots and failed completely, or how many snipers were killed attempting to use beam gap positions, or how many officers dismissed reports of the technique's effectiveness because they never saw dramatic results themselves. History tends to remember successes and forget failures, which distorts our understanding of what actually worked versus what occasionally succeeded through luck or exceptional circumstances. This bias affects all historical understanding of military tactics. We read about successful innovations and assume they were consistently effective, when often they succeeded only occasionally or under specific circumstances. The beam gap technique probably had a success rate far lower than conventional sniping, but the occasional dramatic successes made it memorable, while the routine failures were forgotten. This doesn't mean the technique was valueless, but it suggests we should be cautious about overstating its effectiveness or assuming it represented a significant tactical advance rather than an occasionally useful variation. The sixth critique concerns ethical dimensions of sniping and how the beam gap technique relates to them. All warfare raises ethical questions about killing, but sniping is particularly morally complex because it involves deliberate, calculated killing of specific individuals. The sniper observes his target, identifies him as a human being, and makes a conscious decision to take that specific person's life. This is different psychologically and ethically from the impersonal killing that occurs in artillery barrages or mass infantry combat. The beam gap technique's emphasis on long-range, difficult shots against high-value targets like officers adds additional ethical complexity. Officers were valuable targets precisely because killing them disrupted command and control, potentially saving friendly lives by degrading enemy effectiveness. But officers were also human beings, often men of education and capability, whose deaths represented significant personal tragedies for their families and communities. The calculation of military necessity versus human cost becomes more acute when considering individual acts of targeted killing rather than mass violence. These ethical considerations are not unique to the beam gap technique, but apply to all sniping and indeed to all warfare. However, they deserve articulation because uncritical celebration of tactical innovations can obscure the human costs they inflicted. Every successful shot from a beam gap position meant a human being died, often without warning or chance to defend himself. We can acknowledge the technical skill involved, while also recognizing the moral weight of such killing. The seventh critique concerns the technique's long-term influence and whether lessons from it remain applicable to modern warfare. Military professionals sometimes study historical tactics, assuming that principles identified in past conflicts apply universally. But tactical innovations often succeed because of specific circumstances that may not recur. The beam gap technique worked in the context of static trench warfare, with specific construction practices, specific weapons technology, and specific tactical doctrines. How much relevance does it have to contemporary military operations? Modern warfare has evolved dramatically from World War I trench conditions. Contemporary conflicts feature greater mobility, longer engagement ranges, more sophisticated sensors and weapons, and fundamentally different tactical challenges. The literal application of beam gap techniques is obviously irrelevant. Modern militaries don't fight from trenches built with wooden support beams, but the broader principle, exploiting unconventional positions and angles that enemies don't expect, remains applicable. Modern snipers and designated marksmen still seek positions that provide tactical advantages through surprise and geometry rather than just firepower and protection. The pedagogical value of the beam gap story lies less in specific tactical lessons than in broader insights about innovation, institutional learning, and the relationship between individuals and organizations. These meta-lessons transcend specific technologies and tactical circumstances, remaining relevant as long as militaries must adapt to changing conditions and incorporate innovations from unexpected sources. The story of the beam gap sniper technique exemplifies how warfare drives innovation, how individuals can influence military institutions despite structural barriers, and how tactical creativity emerges from the brutal necessities of combat. The young soldier, whose name history has largely forgotten, recognized an opportunity that trained officers missed, not because he was smarter, but because his perspective differed. He saw trench construction as a tactical environment rather than just an engineering challenge. He understood that geometry and ballistics could be combined in unconventional ways to achieve effects that seemed impossible according to established doctrine. His innovation mattered not because it changed the war's outcome, it did not, but because it illustrated principles of adaptation and learning that apply to all military organizations in all eras. The initial dismissal of his ideas reflected institutional conservatism that serves important purposes but also creates friction against necessary change. The eventual acceptance of his technique after dramatic practical demonstration showed that even conservative institutions can learn when confronted with undeniable evidence. The technique's integration into broader sniper doctrine demonstrated how individual insights can become organizational knowledge when properly captured and disseminated. The shot that killed the German officer at 480 yards stands as the technique's defining moment, the proof of concept that could not be ignored or dismissed. That shot succeeded through a combination of skill, preparation, suitable conditions, and probably some luck. The officer who died that day was performing his duties, observing enemy positions to better command his men and protect them from British attack. He made a reasonable calculation about where he would be safe, a calculation based on established understanding of British sniper capabilities. His calculation was wrong, and it cost him his life. His death was a tactical success for British forces and a personal tragedy for his family and comrades. The soldiers who witnessed this shot, both British and German, understood they had seen something unusual. British troops knew their comrade had accomplished something remarkable, even if they didn't fully understand the technique he had employed. German troops knew their officer had died from an angle that shouldn't have permitted enemy fire, which created psychological unease beyond the immediate tactical loss. Where else might British snipers be hiding? What other assumptions about safe positions were wrong? This psychological dimension multiplied the shot's impact beyond the simple loss of one officer. As word spread through British sniper units, the beam gap technique gained recognition and practitioners. Other snipers began identifying positions in their own trench sections, experimenting with the awkward shooting stances required, developing their own variations and refinements. The technique never became universal, too difficult, too specialized, but it entered the repertoire of elite snipers as another tool for specific circumstances. Training materials incorporated it, at least in abbreviated form. Officers who had dismissed the original proposal now cited it as an example of tactical innovation emerging from frontline experience. The German response evolved as they recognized that something unusual was happening. Their snipers and observers began watching for unconventional positions, trying to identify the specific techniques British snipers were using. Some German units undoubtedly suffered additional casualties before they adapted their security practices. The tactical competition intensified, with each side's innovations prompting counter-innovations in an escalating cycle that characterized sniper warfare throughout the conflict. The beam gap technique was one move in this complex game, temporarily advantageous until enemies adapted, but contributing meanwhile to the broader evolution of sniper tactics. The broader lessons from this story transcend World War I trench warfare. Military organizations continue to grapple with how to encourage innovation while maintaining necessary standardization. Individual soldiers continue to develop insights that challenge established doctrine. Institutional resistance to change continues to create friction against adaptation, even when circumstances demand it. These dynamics persist across eras and technologies because they reflect fundamental tensions in how hierarchical organizations learn and adapt. For modern military professionals, the beam gap story offers several relevant insights. First, innovation often comes from unexpected sources: frontline soldiers, junior officers, specialists rather than senior commanders or doctrine writers. Organizations that dismiss ideas based on source rather than merit risk missing valuable innovations. Second, practical demonstration often proves more persuasive than theoretical argument when advocating for new techniques. The 480-yard shot accomplished what no amount of explanation could have achieved in convincing skeptical officers. Third, successful innovations usually address specific problems in specific contexts rather than offering universal solutions. The beam gap technique worked in trench warfare, but would be irrelevant in maneuver warfare, which is normal. Most tactical innovations have limited applicability. Fourth, documentation and systematic training transform individual insights into organizational capabilities. Without efforts to teach the beam gap technique to other snipers, it would have died with its originator. Military organizations need mechanisms for capturing and disseminating tactical innovations that prove valuable. Fifth, even successful innovations have limitations and costs that must be understood honestly. Uncritical celebration of new techniques can lead to misapplication or over-reliance on approaches that work only under specific circumstances. The fate of the innovator himself remains unknown. Whether he survived the war, whether he received recognition, whether he continued developing tactical innovations or returned to conventional techniques, these details have been lost to history or never recorded in the first place. This anonymity is frustrating from a historical perspective, but also emblematic. Most soldiers who serve in wars, even those who contribute significantly to tactical evolution, disappear from historical memory. Their innovations persist, even as their identities fade. This is perhaps fitting. The technique mattered more than the individual, the tactical evolution more than the specific people who drove it. The German officer killed at 480 yards also remains anonymous, at least in records available to us. He was someone's son, possibly someone's husband or father, almost certainly an educated man of some achievement given his rank. His death was one of millions that occurred on the Western Front, not particularly more tragic or significant than countless others, except that it validated a tactical innovation that makes his death historically notable. From his family's perspective, the circumstances of his death probably mattered less than the simple fact that he died and would not return home. War's human costs are not diminished by whether deaths result from conventional or innovative tactics. The trench systems where the beam gap technique was employed have long since been erased by time and agriculture. The specific gaps between beams that provided those unconventional sightlines were dismantled in the war's aftermath. The ground where sniper and target faced each other across 480 yards of no man's land is now farmland. The violence and innovation of 1915 buried beneath decades of peaceful cultivation. Physical traces of the war persist in some areas, preserved trenches, memorials, unexploded ordnance, but the tactical details have faded into historical records and veterans' memories, most of which have themselves been lost. What persists is the principle: warfare drives innovation, and innovation often comes from unexpected sources when necessity demands creative solutions to tactical problems. The beam gap sniper technique represents one small chapter in the endless story of military adaptation, a footnote to larger narratives about World War I and trench warfare. But small stories often illuminate larger truths better than grand narratives. This story of an anonymous soldier, whose unconventional idea was initially dismissed but ultimately validated, tells us something important about how military organizations learn, how individuals can influence institutions, and how tactical creativity emerges from the brutal necessities of combat. The world initially ignored his beam gap sniper angle because it contradicted established doctrine, seemed impractical, and came from a source without formal authority. Then he took out a German officer at 480 yards, and everything changed. The shot proved what argument could not: that unconventional thinking, combined with exceptional skill and favorable circumstances, could achieve effects that conventional analysis deemed impossible. This validation did not transform warfare or alter the war's outcome, but it contributed incrementally to tactical evolution and demonstrated principles that remain relevant whenever military organizations must balance tradition against innovation, doctrine against adaptation, and institutional wisdom against individual insight. The forgotten soldier who developed the beam gap technique deserves remembering not as a war hero. His role was too small for such grandiosity, but as an exemplar of innovation under pressure, of individual creativity within institutional constraints, and of the persistence required to validate ideas that others dismiss. His story, incomplete and fragmentary as it is, reminds us that progress often comes from the margins, that orthodoxy sometimes blinds us to opportunities, and that practical demonstration remains the ultimate arbiter when theory confronts reality. These lessons transcend his specific circumstances and his lost identity, persisting as long as humans study how organizations adapt and how individuals influence change within them.